A quick sketch, if you will. You are 10 years old. It's summer, the weather outside is nice and warm. It's early, but your parents are already awake. They're getting dressed to go on their usual trip to the mall, but you're spared. Somehow you manage to talk them into leaving you at home. The doorbell rings. It's your friend from the house across the road. Cool, you think. Now we can get started. The two of you go to the living room, turn on the TV, then the Sega Mega Drive under it, insert the cartridge and wait to check if the gamepads are working. The next thing you hear is your mom's voice. They are leaving. Replying something automatically, you stare mesmerized at the screen, because it is now time for Mortal Kombat Ultimate. Oh yeah, those were good times. Though I'm not sure Sega was competing on the market or had even entered when our viewers were 10 years old. After all, we're watched by different age groups. That's why you may not have felt the same sweet taste of nostalgia that has just washed over our other viewers, who had such moment in their past. Regardless, this doesn't change the topic. Our today's guest is the Mortal Kombat series, which made most of our childhood. And it doesn't matter whether it was the first part or the ultimate third, whether you got acquainted with the franchise in the early 2000s or have noticed it only after the reboot in 2011. In any time period since the early 90s, the series has been shining in the sky, while being the worst nightmare of every gamepad. What gives? What's the secret of MK's longevity and unceasing vigor? Today, while avoiding looking on one game and instead looking analytically at the series as a whole, we'll try to understand why the franchise enjoys so much love and what makes it different from other fightings. We have a decisive fight ahead of us, dear friends. What will be the outcome? Time will tell. Let's get to it. In the early 90s, the life of the series was going at breakneck speed. Thus, the first three parts were released between 92 and 95. The franchise moved from arcade machines to home platforms, which greatly expanded its user base. They also released a movie called Mortal Kombat, directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, who's known for Resident Evil and Monster Hunter. See the tendency? The director is clearly a fan of everything game-ish, and Mortal Kombat was his first experience in this field, as it turned out later, also the most successful. It is hilarious to see how this series, which was born from the idea of making a game based on a classic action movie hero by Van Damme, later gave birth to a movie that has received more love from youngsters than any Van Damme movie of those years. I mean, seriously, have you seen Street Fighter with him? Shame on it! However, it was also based on a well-respected video game, but there can be no competition. Anderson made a really good live action with memorable characters, clear relationships, spectacular fights, and of course, a killer soundtrack. And don't pretend that you don't know this tune. That's what I'm talking about. When you think of Mortal, this song comes to mind. When you hear this song, you think of Mortal. Thanks to the movie, countless new folks learned about the game of the same name. Besides, by that time it already had an extensive lore, which is nearly impossible to comprehend without a shot or two, constant and well-written characters, a dope control system, and many, tons of finishes, which were a pure pleasure to experiment with. And of course, the reason why every other Sweeney toddler wanted to play this fighting instead of Street Fighter, Tekken or Guilty Gear was an exorbitant amount of brutality for the time. Breaking bones, smashing faces, tearing off heads or burning opponents alive. Groovy, isn't it? YouTube, please don't mark it as 18+, we're just playing games here. There was this another effect that also contributed. All the models in the first trilogy were very realistic. This was done by filming live actors, how they perform certain moves and so on. The footage was then digitized and put into the project. And if today such a thing looks controversial, back then it was breathtaking. No pixel art, typical for the majority of games from the East, Characters don't look like shapeless piles of cartoonish muscles. In fact, they look quite human. Just what a Western player wanted. Here's a head, here's a leg, everything can be torn off. It even prompted the appearance of ESRB, the bureau which is responsible for giving age restrictions to video games. Yes, FYI, the motivation behind the establishment of this organization, which is now used by data miners to determine how soon a game will be released, was indeed Mortal Kombat. In 1997, the fourth installment of the series didn't do well. Although it was the first in the family of three-dimensional Mortal Kombats, it wasn't much of a figure on the timeline of the history of video games. Although the fifth, sixth, and seventh parts were more known. I remember playing Armageddon with my homie on PlayStation. Though the new contraption from Sony was a thing only to an elite cast of teenagers in the early 2000s, so the game didn't strike the young minds as the Ultimate Part 3 did. However, by and large it was quite popular, especially if you go to Wikipedia. The seventh part was built on the usual pillars of the series: a decent range of playable characters, a well-developed combat system, excellent graphics, off-the-charts violence, and cool lore. They only added one extra dimension. Yes, the additional spatial axis, which did the games no good. Remember the failure of the fourth part. But then the developers fixed the situation, and to this day everything is all good. The additional dimension diversified the fights, giving interactivity to the environment and freedom to the player's strategic genius. Now it was possible to wheel around the enemy, waiting for the moment to attack, like in Soul Calibur. Speaking of Soul Calibur, this series is famous for giving players the ability to use weapons against each other. In the fourth and, if I'm not mistaken, in the fifth parts of Mortal, you could do the same. But the thing didn't catch on, and the reboot of the franchise renounced all the weapons. By reboot, I mean the ninth part of the series that came out in 2011, which for me personally became the game that felt like it came from my childhood. You know that weird feeling, you play something when you are 8, 9 or 10 years old, and years later this memory strikes you and everything in the game seems so elaborate all of a sudden. The graphics are awesome, the controls are most responsive, this kind of stuff. And then you go back to that nostalgic title and it turns out that the graphics are different and the controls are weird. So the ninth MK for me was the Mortal Kombat that I felt like I spent my youth playing. It was as if a project from my memories had been transported straight into my TV. I remembered exactly the same graphics, exactly the same characters, and exactly the same controls. Although the game remained three-dimensional, some of the advantages of the extra dimension were lost. For example, now it was impossible to dance around with your opponent. However, the interactivity of the arenas remained unscathed. The title also allowed to play as almost any character of the franchise, while the novelty in the form of X-ray made you shudder not only during fatalities. Every time the rage scale was full, the player could use a special attack that could take off a third of the opponent's HP and show every injury you inflict in X-ray. This only increased the level of violence, which was to the orthodox fans' liking. But definitely not the content makers. YouTube, don't ban, please, these aren't real organs and bones. As for the 10th and 11th installments, the developers decided not to reinvent the wheel. They systematically improved what was already there and increased the range of playable characters with some guests: Terminator, Joker, and so on. Of course, there was one detail that the developers were only making worse, but we'll talk about this trend of the whole game industry at the end. For now, let's focus on the pros and try to figure out how they gave us the Mortal Kombat phenomenon. Let's address the elephant in the room. What do we love most about Mortal Kombat? I'm sure most of us would say the violence, and I'll be among them. This detail of the gameplay had caused quite a lot of fuss from particularly zealous defenders of children's psyche back in the day. However, the prohibitive way of solving this problem is only given the opposite reaction, which correlates with the so-called forbidden fruit theory. The point is that the more we are told not to look at something or not to do something, the more we want to do so. You know, just like a kid. So when the game got enveloped with a mist of hatred, it only encouraged gamers to pay attention to the title. In the 21st century, the talk about the excessive violence in Mortal has not subsided. The more detailed the game became, the more talk and concern it sparked. But has such PR ever hindered audiovisual products? Well, I mean as long as they don't cross the line, which MK abidingly sticks to. The dismemberment here may be naturalistic, but it has nothing to do with reality. I'm sorry, but when mid-battle the characters break their arms and legs and then continue fighting as if nothing happened, what's there left to say? Mortal Kombat is walking right on the edge. The developers don't go into utter blasphemy, but they're not going to feed cartoons to the player, which quickly made them stand out among their Eastern colleagues. Take the previously mentioned Street Fighter, an even older series, perhaps also a more respected one, but much less famous, not exactly a people's game. Why? Have you seen how hyperbolized the characters in this game are? No, I don't mind the exaggerations that the designers made with Chun-Li, if you get my meaning. However, in general, the characters of the series don't look like real people, while the characters of Mortal Kombat do. Yes, physically developed at that, which is why the girls from the game are often attacked by warriors of morality and knights of body positivity. But still, their cosplays, males included, are sometimes extremely close to the actual video game looks. Perhaps also because of this, it was easier to make a movie based on the franchise, which, by the way, made a huge box office and greatly increased the popularity of the series. Can you recall any other video game that got such a good screen adaptation, especially for its time? Once again, take Street Fighter, a ghastly example. The 1994 movie was a laughingstock, which is completely different from the anime of the same year. It was cool in the spirit of Street Fighter and had some really great fights. But it was more for the domestic market because 30 years ago, Japanese animation was not yet known outside of the island just east of China. So what do we have? Mortal had a great PR in the beginning thanks to the violence and the cool movie. Plus the game appealed to the Western gamer visually, which granted it a bigger player base. However, it should be said that gameplay-wise the fighting wasn't far behind its competitors in the market either. It was walking the edge, just as before, giving experience to seasoned gamers and casuals alike. That is, these stories about a newbie kicking a pro gamer's ass just by spamming one button were actually based on reality. The game was really capable of being fun even when the player didn't even know how to play. MK had and still has a very low entry threshold. You can literally bring your friends that have never played a fighting game before and just disappear from the real world for several hours. Just look for fatality hints every now and then, and everything should be fine. However, simplicity is deceiving. The brainchild of that Boone, who is the permanent producer of the Mortal series, has a deep potential. It has impeccably calibrated timings, an enormous range of techniques, and vast room for experimentation. The fighters are more or less equal, which is why no one is OP. You can learn to fight for any one of them at such a level that even Shao Kahn on maximum difficulty will be no more than a practice fight. To this day, my favorite is Kitana, even though it's hard for me to look at what they did to her in the last few games. And it's not really about the looks. It's like she's had her leg range nerfed too, no? Share your opinion down in the comments, and don't forget to mention which character is your favorite. I'm sure there'll be a lot for you to tell, because the next thing that holds a part of the game's phenomenality is the number of available characters. Damn, each time I get to pick a character I feel dizzy. I mean, it's no Mugen, but still. After all, in the span of its rich history, the series has accumulated quite a number of characters. Here you have both old-timers like Sub-Zero and Scorpion, and newcomers that join the gang each game, like Cassie and Jackie. Their appearance actually fits the story, which, contrary to all expectations, is in fact here and is not bad at that. The thrills behind each death battle got to their precipice in the reboot. The stories of the 10th and 11th parts are so epic that they really deserve the player's attention. It's no longer just an excuse to brawl, but a separate, interesting part of the game, which has both intrigue and drama. In short and without spoilers, it's awesome. By the way, thanks to the story, the characters have actual relationships with each other, which are shown perfectly before each fight. One of the game's calling cards is the fighters' intros, memorable, sleek, with sharp quotes. In recent years, they perhaps have become as popular as the fatalities, which is evident from the amount of compilations on YouTube, which is also a part of the phenomenon, only without such a long history as the finishers, but still.
I'll incinerate you and your ice cream.
What part of never melt don't you understand, you flaming turd?
A flaming turd probably tastes 10 times better.
You dare insult a man's ice cream?
What are you gonna do about it, Snowflake?
You are dead!
As for the fresh elements of the franchise's phenomenality, how can we forget about the guest fighters? Who among the boys of the 90s didn't dream of fighting as Rambo or the Terminator, eh? I certainly wouldn't mind. And now, in the 11th part, I finally got my chance. Pretty damn awesome, isn't it? All these elements intertwine to create a game that manages to both keep its original, authentic image and satisfies fan demands. MK is a precedent that masterfully combines excellent game design and the community's fancies, which today not everyone likes and which is going to be our next topic. We live in a world of pluralism. If someone likes something, there are bound to be those who find it offensive. In the past, such people were usually from the outside, by which I mean that they were journalists or politicians who tried to make a name for themselves using video games. The lawyer Jack Thompson, who devoted his life to attacking GTA and has been unemployed for over 9 years, serves as a perfect example. Now, the place of such Thompsons is often taken by people directly involved into video games, players and developers. They don't like way too revealing outfits of female characters, way too sexualized bodies, way too much violence, and many other things. There is an opinion that these people are very few, and only thanks to their extreme activity do they attract the attention of the press and the public. But I have not been able to find any confirmation to this. Yet the fact that the girls in MK have lost something is pretty obvious. And if the shapes of the damsels are not as crucial, losing the violence would mean losing the image of an iconic game. Ed Boon and his team realize that, which is why they're making concessions only when it comes to the outfits of Katana and Co. It also deprives the series of its spice, if you will. The essence and phenomenon of Mortal lie in its boldness, in that very walking on the edge. Let's summarize all the available facts that make the franchise memorable. A high level of violence, a vast range of characters with different combat styles and personal backstories, so you don't feel like you're playing as a faceless dummy. An original style, which is dominated by the well-known elements of Western culture, yet features Eastern tropes that remind you of martial arts. Say monks or an Asian kung fu master is the main character of the first parts. We are talking about Liu Kang. A decent story which is going through a renaissance in the newer installments of the series. Intuitive controls, which make the game accessible both for fighting veterans and those who had never held a gamepad before. All of the above make the backbone of the franchise's phenomenon. It is aided by isolated cases of competent PR, which only spread the word about the game, while it perfectly managed on its own to actually keep the player. We're talking both about scandals and movies, which the series has no problem with. Just recently another movie has hit the cinemas. The film is far from perfect, but it certainly isn't terrible. Besides, it's yet another way to gain some popularity. All this is the phenomenon we are talking about, and nowadays one of its parts is slowly being cut back. Female characters are unacceptably sexualized for the Western audience, which is why both in the 10th and 11th parts of the series the devs started to hide their curves. Not so long ago there was one case that received special publicity. The fact is that actress Carrie Ann Hoskins, who played Sonya in the third part, issued a statement against such changes to her heroine. Opinions on the matter are divided. The Twitter post, or shall I say X, thanks Elon, attracted quite a lot of people both for and against Hoskins' stance. And what do you think, dear viewers? Let us know in the comments. I think it's not very cool to do that with a game series that has always been up for a risk and was more willing to create its own rules, rather than to adapt to others. Along with that, it should be noted that the last and probably most important element of the franchise's phenomenality is that with each game the developers have always listened to the fans and tried to satisfy the desires of their fanbase. More characters? Here you go. Want romantic stories? You got it. Bring back fun and peaceful finishes like babalities and friendships? No problem.
Friendship. Katana wins. Flawless victory.
Need more violence? The advertising campaign of every installment puts it on the front. More broken bones, more spilled blood. Just the way you want it. And so on. But what do you do when one part of the community asks for one thing and the other part asks for another? Apparently here the developers gave in to the current of the market and social code. Which is a bit strange because if we are to look for the core of the MK phenomenon, it lies in an aspect that's most condemned and difficult to market – inhumane violence. It makes us shudder and at the same time attracts us. In 2011, scientists Anne Botch and Louis Morris found out that people watch movies with violent scenes more willingly than without them. This has many explanations. For one, such scenes can prepare the viewer for the cruelty of the real world, or give him a shot of powerful emotions that our body craves, but which it has been deprived by the blessings of civilization. I'm sure you remember your curiosity the moment you found out that the game allowed you to cut people in half. 8-year-old me was thrilled at the prospect. The 25-year-old me, however, is no less happy about a juicy fatality, to be honest. And at such moments, any story, lore, and even the appearance of the characters recede into the background. It's like ancient Rome, the most civilized civilization with philosophers and working sewers. But as soon as the residents gather in the Colosseum, forget it. Now there's a hooting crowd which only craves bread and games. Which means that blood and gore has been a guilty pleasure for us since time immemorial, and so far, not much has changed, sadly. So in the end, we have a whole bunch of factors. In other words, MK is a precedent of boldness, freshness, and the community's fancies woven into the whole thing. But in the midst of this cocktail, like a black hole in the center of our galaxy, there's a core called kick-ass. Fight people and do so with all the cruelty, but only in virtual space. That's what the phenomenal Mortal Kombat series was made for. And I guess I'm gonna go and play a couple of rounds too, but quickly of course, as I still have to make content for you folks. If you want to check it out as soon as it comes out, then be sure to tackle that subscribe button with both your feet and leave a like as a fatality. Release your aggression only in video games and stay tuned!